It started as a typical flight passenger's boarding, flight attendants bustling to prepare, and a quiet hum settling over the cabin. But when an elderly black woman, dressed in an elegant navy suit and pearl necklace, made her way to a plush first-class seat, things took an unexpected turn. The head flight attendant, polished and ambitious, spotted the woman and immediately assumed there must be a mistake. Her tone was sharp, her demeanor dismissive as she questioned the woman's presence in first class. Despite presenting her boarding pass, the woman was subjected to further scrutiny, her dignity tested in full view of other passengers. But then, just as tensions peaked, the woman calmly reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and made a single call. Moments later, the truth shattered the assumptions of everyone on board. Her husband wasn't just anyone, he was the founder of the very airline they were flying on. What unfolded next left passengers speechless and the flight attendant's career hanging in the balance. Stay with me, because this story doesn't just challenge stereotypes, it flips them on their head. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates, don't forget to subscribe for more tales that inspired change and justice. Eleanor Grant stepped onto the plane with the air of someone who had long learned to carry herself through a world that had not always welcomed her. At 68, her silver-streaked hair framed a face marked by both the wisdom of experience and the resilience of survival. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, with a pearl necklace resting lightly against her collar, she moved with deliberate elegance down the aisle, a picture of composure. Yet, beneath her poise, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of eyes that did not look, but judged. The murmurs began as soon as she passed the first row of economy. They weren't loud, but they were sharp enough to puncture the bubble of comfort Eleanor had crafted over decades. Whispers coiled through the cabin like smoke. Who is she? Did she take a wrong turn? First class? The words stung with the bitterness of assumptions Eleanor had faced since she was a girl. Eleanor ignored them, walking toward the first-class cabin with the unyielding determination that had carried her through far worse than curious strangers. She had learned long ago that to stop, to address every indignity, would leave her perpetually in battle. And Eleanor was too wise to waste her energy on small minds. She clutched her boarding pass in one hand, her small leather bag in the other, and took her place at the boundary between the world she had worked to enter and the one that refused to let her forget how she had come to be there. Heather Davis, the head flight attendant, spotted Eleanor before she reached the first-class seats. Heather had always prided herself on her ability to read passengers, to sort them into neat categories: businessman, tourist, first-timer. But something about Eleanor disrupted her usual assessments. Heather's gaze flickered over the tailored suit and pearls, but her mind snagged on the subtle incongruities: Eleanor's skin, the quiet self-assurance that seemed to challenge Heather's unspoken rules about belonging. Heather approached with the crisp efficiency of someone used to being in control. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, stepping into Eleanor's path with a tight, professional smile. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" The tone was polite, but Eleanor had heard it before. She'd heard it in department stores, in banks, in restaurants where she had been made to feel out of place despite being exactly where she had earned the right to be. Eleanor's grip on her boarding pass tightened slightly, but her expression remained calm. "Quite sure," Eleanor replied evenly, handing over her ticket. Her voice, though soft, carried the kind of authority that only comes from decades of practice in navigating unspoken hostility. Heather examined the ticket, her eyes darting from the seat assignment to Eleanor and back again. "Ah, I see," she said after a moment, handing it back, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Please, let me know if you need anything." Eleanor inclined her head, a gesture that could be read as either gratitude or dismissal, and moved past Heather to her seat. She settled in with a small sigh, her movements measured as she adjusted the pillow behind her back. Around her, first-class passengers exchanged subtle glances, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word. Eleanor caught a few of their eyes and held their gaze for just a beat too long. Enough to remind them that she saw them seeing her. From the galley, Heather watched. Something about Eleanor unsettled her, though she couldn't have said exactly what. It wasn't that the ticket was fake or that Eleanor had done anything wrong, it was something else. Something Heather didn't dare name even to herself. She turned to one of her colleagues, a younger flight attendant named Sarah Lopez, and whispered, "She's in first class." Sarah frowned, Confused. Her ticket says first class. Right? Yes. But, Heather trailed off, glancing toward Eleanor's seat. It just feels off. Sarah's expression hardened slightly. Maybe it just feels off to you. Heather stiffened at the quiet rebuke but said nothing. Instead, she busied herself with preparations for the flight, her movements sharper than necessary. In her mind, the story of Eleanor Grant had already begun to twist itself into something larger. Something that justified her unease. Meanwhile, Eleanor opened the book she had brought for the flight. Though she wasn't reading, her eyes skimmed the words. But her mind was elsewhere. Caught in the tension that had thickened the air around her. She could feel it pressing against her skin, the weight of doubt, of scrutiny, of assumptions that would never be spoken aloud but hung heavily nonetheless. The cabin hummed with the low murmur of conversation, the soft clink of glasses as pre-flight drinks were served. It was a familiar rhythm, one Eleanor had experienced countless times. Yet today it felt different. Or perhaps it was the same. And Eleanor was simply too tired to ignore it. The momentary calm shattered when Heather returned. This time with a strained smile that barely concealed her tension. "Ma'am," she said, her tone overly polite, "I'm going to need to see your ticket again. Just a routine check." Eleanor's head lifted slowly, her eyes meeting Heather's with a quiet intensity. "I've already shown you my ticket," she said, her voice as steady as the hum of the plane's engines. "Is there something else you'd like to check?" Passengers turned in their seats, the weight of their curiosity adding to the pressure of the moment. Eleanor handed over the ticket again, her movements deliberate and calm, though her heart beat just a little faster. Heather scanned it unnecessarily thoroughly before handing it back. "Thank you," she said curtly, spinning on her heel and returning to the galley. This time, Heather didn't bother whispering. "I'm going to have security check this out," she announced to Sarah, her voice tinged with frustration. "Something's not right." Sarah hesitated, her brows knitting together. "Don't you think that's a bit much?" "It's protocol," Heather snapped, her voice rising slightly. "If something feels wrong, we address it." Back in her seat, Eleanor felt the shift. The glances were longer now, the whispers more pointed. She closed her book and rested her hands in her lap, her fingers brushing against the simple gold ring on her finger. Her husband Victor had once told her that dignity was its own kind of armor. Eleanor wore hers now, though it did little to soften the edges of the hostility she could feel sharpening around her. Across the aisle, Kevin Lynn, the young tech entrepreneur, angled his phone subtly toward the scene, his discomfort growing as he observed the dynamic. He'd seen videos like this before, viral moments that captured injustice in real time. He didn't want to believe he was watching one unfold now. But the tension in the cabin was undeniable. And as Heather returned, this time accompanied by a uniformed security officer, the quiet storm Eleanor had carried for decades began to stir. The cabin was a symphony of quiet sounds, the rustle of newspapers, the soft hum of the engines, and the occasional clink of glasses. Yet, underneath the calm surface, tension brewed like a storm waiting for the right moment to strike. Eleanor Grant sat in her seat, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on the book that remained closed in her lap. She wasn't reading, she was listening. Heather Davis appeared again, this time with a uniformed security officer in tow. The officer, a tall, broad man with an air of authority, glanced toward Eleanor with a flicker of unease. He had been briefed on the situation, something vague about a routine check, but even he seemed to sense that whatever this was, it wasn't routine. "Ma'am," Heather began, her voice louder now, cutting through the subdued murmurs of the cabin. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside for further verification." Eleanor looked up slowly, her gaze meeting Heather's with a calmness that belied the quiet fury building inside her. She had spent decades refining this expression, one that could deflect 1,000 indignities while keeping her dignity intact. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but steady. "And what, exactly, are you verifying?" "It's just protocol," Heather said, her smile tight, her tone clipped. "If you'll come with us, we can clear this up quickly." Eleanor's hand moved to her purse, her fingers brushing over the leather as she drew it into her lap. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for her phone. "I'm afraid I can't do that without understanding the reason for this interruption," she said. Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet steel that cut through Heather's practiced facade. Around them, passengers began to take notice. Heads turned, conversations hushed, and a few brave souls craned their necks to get a better view. Across the aisle, Kevin Lynn's phone was already recording, the lens discreetly capturing every moment of the interaction. He glanced at the older woman, her composure intact despite the growing tension, and felt a pang of anger on her behalf. Heather's cheeks flushed as the weight of the cabin's attention settled on her. "Ma'am," she said, her voice faltering for the first time, "we can handle this discreetly. But you need to cooperate." Eleanor didn't rise. Instead, she placed her phone to her ear and dialed a number. "I believe this is something my husband can help with," she said, her tone still maddeningly calm. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his hand brushing the radio at his hip as if he might need it. "Victor," Eleanor said into the phone, her voice carrying now, "there seems to be some confusion about my presence in first class. Would you mind clarifying this for them?" She extended the phone toward Heather, her expression serene but unyielding. "My husband would like a word." The cabin fell into a tense silence as Heather hesitated, her eyes darting from the phone to Eleanor's face and then to the security officer beside her. Finally, with a trembling hand, she took the phone. "Hello?" she said, her voice tight. The voice on the other end was unmistakably commanding. "This is Victor Grant," it said, "founder of this airline. May I ask why my wife is being harassed on one of my planes?" Heather's face drained of color. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and even the security officer shifted uncomfortably at the weight of them. Passengers whispered among themselves, their murmurs swelling into a low hum of speculation and outrage. Heather stammered, her usual poise evaporating. "I didn't realize." "You didn't realize what?" Victor's voice cut through the static of her panic. "That the woman you've been treating so poorly helped build this company? Or that your actions are entirely inappropriate and unacceptable? Either way, you owe her an apology." Heather handed the phone back to Eleanor, her hands shaking. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean." Eleanor raised a hand, silencing her. "Your apology is noted," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy the rest of my flight." Heather retreated, her steps hurried and uneven as she disappeared into the galley. The security officer followed, his face flushed with embarrassment. Eleanor returned her phone to her purse and picked up her book, flipping it open as if nothing had happened. But her heart was racing, and the room seemed to thrum with an energy she couldn't ignore. Across the aisle, Kevin Lynn finished typing a caption onto his video and hit post. He knew it wouldn't be long before the world saw what had just unfolded. As he glanced toward Eleanor, she caught his eye and offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of quiet solidarity. In the galley, Heather stood with her back against the counter, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. Sarah approached cautiously, her brow furrowed with concern. "Heather," she said softly, "maybe you should sit down." Heather shook her head, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "I didn't know," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know who she was." Sarah's expression hardened. "Does it matter who she is? She showed you her ticket. She belonged in first class. That should have been enough." Heather looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. She couldn't admit what she was thinking, not here. Not now. But the truth was like a weight in her chest, pressing down with every breath. It wasn't just about the ticket. It was about what she had assumed, what she had believed, and what that said about her. Back in her seat, Eleanor closed her book again. She couldn't read. The storm inside her was too loud now. The echoes of a lifetime of moments like this one crashing against the walls she had built to protect herself. She glanced out the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the anger, the frustration, and the sadness that came with knowing this battle was far from over. The plane hummed on, carrying its passengers toward their destination. But for Eleanor Grant, the journey had only just begun. The plane cruised steadily at 30,000 feet. But inside the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor Grant sat motionless in her first-class seat, the faint hum of the engines filling the silence around her, though her face betrayed none of the emotions churning inside. Her hands rested on the book in her lap as though holding onto it for balance. The confrontation with Heather Davis still echoed in her mind, A reminder of the invisible lines she had spent her life crossing, lines that had never been drawn for others. Around her, passengers exchanged furtive glances. They whispered in low voices, their curiosity simmering just beneath the surface. Eleanor was used to this kind of attention, the mixture of intrigue and suspicion that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She had hoped that at her age, having fought her battles, proven her worth, she might finally be free of it. But here it was again, as persistent as ever, reminding her that even in the skies, prejudice found a way to take flight. In the galley, Heather leaned against the counter, her polished veneer cracking. Her colleague, Sarah Lopez, stood nearby, arms crossed, an expression unreadable. Heather couldn't meet Sarah's gaze, couldn't face the unspoken judgment that hung between them. "I don't get it," Heather said finally, her voice brittle. "Why does this feel so big?" Sarah tilted her head, her voice measured. "Because it is big, Heather. You didn't just question her ticket. You questioned her place. And whether you meant to or not, everyone in that cabin saw it." Heather's jaw tightened. "It wasn't like that," she protested weakly. But even she didn't believe her own words. Sarah took a step closer, her voice soft but firm. "You're right. It wasn't like that. It was worse. Because it wasn't about her ticket, it was about what you saw when you looked at her." Heather's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she turned away, reaching for a clipboard as though it might shield her from the truth Sarah had laid bare. Back in the cabin, Eleanor caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Kevin Lynn, the young businessman who had been watching her closely, rose from his seat. He approached her tentatively, his phone tucked into his pocket. "Mrs. Grant," he began, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I just wanted to say, what happened back there wasn't right." Eleanor looked up at him, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent navigating moments like this one. "But it's not the first time. And it won't be the last." Kevin hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the galley where Heather had disappeared. "I posted the video," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "People need to see this." Eleanor's brow furrowed, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "What people need to see," she said carefully, "is the bigger picture. Not just this moment, but the story behind it, the story that doesn't start or end with me." Kevin nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. He returned to his seat, but his expression remained troubled, as though he were grappling with the weight of Eleanor's words. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, momentarily breaking the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some turbulence ahead. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." Eleanor felt the plane shudder slightly as it hit the first pockets of rough air. She leaned back in her seat, letting her gaze drift to the window. The clouds outside were thick and gray, a fitting reflection of the unease that had settled in her chest. The turbulence seemed to mirror the growing unrest in the cabin. Passengers whispered more openly now, their curiosity emboldened by the events they had witnessed. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her, could hear their questions hanging in the air like static electricity. Who is she? Why did it happen? What does it mean? In the galley, Heather paced, her thoughts racing faster than she could control. She could still hear Victor Grant's voice ringing in her ears, his words a reminder of the power she had so carelessly underestimated. She thought of the other passengers, their judgmental stares, their silent condemnation, and she thought of Eleanor, sitting there with the kind of grace that made Heather's own behavior feel small and petty in comparison. Sarah's voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "You need to fix this," she said simply. Heather stopped pacing, her brow furrowing. "Fix what? What am I supposed to do, Sarah?" "Start by owning up to it," Sarah said, "not just to her, but to yourself." Heather opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a sudden jolt of turbulence rocked the plane. The lights flickered briefly, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Eleanor's hand instinctively gripped the armrest as the plane steadied itself. She had faced turbulence before, both in the air and in life, and she knew better than to panic. But the jolt seemed to unsettle something deeper, as though the storm outside was conspiring with the one inside. She glanced toward the galley, where Heather now stood frozen, her face pale. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Eleanor saw something there: fear, perhaps, or guilt. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to remind her that even the people who caused harm were often carrying their own burdens. Heather broke the gaze first, turning away as though unable to face the quiet strength in Eleanor's eyes. The turbulence subsided, but the cabin remained tense. Eleanor could feel the unease radiating from the passengers, the silent weight of their questions pressing against her. She closed her book again, unable to focus on the words. Instead, she let her mind drift, remembering the countless times she had sat in spaces like this, feeling the same quiet storm brewing around her. But this time was different. This time, the storm wasn't just hers to weather. It was everyone's, and as the plane hurtled through the sky, Eleanor knew that the turbulence inside would only grow stronger before it passed. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet after the turbulence passed, but the atmosphere was far from calm. Eleanor Grant sat with her hands folded neatly over her book, her back straight against the plush seat. From the outside, she looked composed, every inch the dignified woman she had worked her entire life to be. Inside, however, a fire smoldered hot and constant. She had thought she'd grown used to these moments, but there was something about this one that felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of not just her own experiences, but those of generations before her. Across the aisle, Kevin Lynn's phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out. The video he had posted just an hour earlier had already started to gain traction. The comments were a cacophony of opinions. This is disgraceful. What was she even doing in first class? Respect to that woman for handling it with such grace. The reactions mirrored the divided world Kevin had seen so often but never fully understood until now. He glanced at Eleanor, her profile illuminated by the faint glow of the cabin lights, and felt the gravity of the moment. In the galley, Heather Davis leaned heavily against the counter, staring at the clipboard in her hands without really seeing it. Her chest tightened with every passing second, her mind replaying the confrontation over and over. She had miscalculated badly. The realization gnawed at her, not just because she had been called out, but because deep down, she knew Sarah was right. It wasn't about the ticket, it was about her assumptions. And now, with the eyes of the entire cabin on her, Heather felt like she was drowning. Heather. Sarah's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. You can't just stand here pretending nothing happened. You need to go back out there. Heather's head snapped up. And do what, Sarah? Humiliate myself even more? I've already apologized. Sarah took a step closer, her tone firm but calm. You apologized because you had to, not because you wanted to. There's a difference, and everyone out there can feel it. Heather shook her head, her voice rising slightly. You don't understand. This isn't just about her. It's about how everyone's looking at me now. Like I'm the villain. Sarah's expression softened, but her words remained sharp. Maybe you are, Heather, at least for today. But being the villain doesn't mean you can't change. It just means you have to try harder. Heather opened her mouth to respond, but a sudden burst of laughter from a group of passengers outside the galley drew her attention. It wasn't the kind of laughter that came from joy, it was sharp, derisive, the kind of sound that made your skin crawl. She glanced through the curtain and saw a man in a crisp business suit gesturing toward Eleanor's seat. His voice too loud to be ignored. Honestly, I don't know why everyone's making such a fuss, the man said, shaking his head. If you ask me, first class should be for people who look like they belong here. The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Eleanor didn't flinch, but her grip on her book tightened just enough for those paying attention to notice. Kevin Lynn stiffened in his seat, his fingers twitching as though he wanted to respond but didn't know how. Eleanor turned her head slowly, meeting the man's gaze with a calm that burned hotter than any outburst ever could. And what, exactly? She asked, her voice low but razor sharp. Does someone who belongs here look like? The man blinked, clearly unprepared for a response. I didn't mean anything by it, he said quickly, his bravado faltering. I just meant well, you know. No, I don't know, Eleanor interrupted, her tone unwavering. But please, enlighten me. The man opened and closed his mouth, his face flushing as the murmurs of other passengers began to grow. A woman seated nearby shot him a sharp look and muttered, "Unbelievable," under her breath. Heather, who had been watching from the galley, felt her stomach churn. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear into the background. But Sarah's voice echoed in her mind. Being the villain doesn't mean you can't change. Heather stepped out of the galley, her footsteps hesitant but purposeful. She approached the man in the business suit, her heart pounding in her chest. "Sir," she said, her voice louder than she intended, "I need to ask you to lower your voice and show respect for all passengers on this flight." The man turned to her, his expression shifting from embarrassment to indignation. "I wasn't being disrespectful," he said defensively. "I was just making an observation." Heather didn't waver. "Your observation was inappropriate, and it disrupted the comfort of other passengers. Please refrain from making further comments." The man muttered something under his breath but sank back into his seat, crossing his arms like a child who had been scolded. Heather turned to Eleanor, who was watching her with an expression that was unreadable but no longer icy. Heather swallowed hard. "Mrs. Grant," she said softly, "I'm sorry for what you've had to endure. If there's anything I can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable, please let me know." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, the silence stretching taut between them. Then, with a slight nod, she said, "Thank you. That will be all." Heather returned to the galley, her legs shaking beneath her. Sarah was waiting for her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" Heather sighed, leaning against the counter. "Harder than you think." The rest of the flight passed in relative quiet, but the undercurrents of tension remained. Eleanor gazed out the window, her reflection faint against the endless expanse of clouds. She thought of the man in the business suit, of Heather, of all the people she had encountered over the years who had tried to make her smaller, less than, and she thought of the moments like this one when the storm threatened to overwhelm her. But she stood her ground anyway. As the captain announced their descent, Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the engines soothe her frayed nerves. She had faced another battle, another storm, and she had survived, as she always did, but the fight wasn't over. It never was. The plane touched down with a smoothness that belied the turbulence of the journey. Eleanor Grant remained seated as the passengers around her began to shuffle and gather their belongings, their voices buzzing with a renewed energy that had been absent earlier. For many, the events of the flight had been an intriguing diversion, a story to tell later over drinks or dinner. But for Eleanor, the weight of what had transpired lingered like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Heather Davis stood near the galley, her hands clasped tightly together. She watched as passengers filed past, their expressions ranging from neutral to subtly judgmental. She caught Sarah's eye from across the cabin. Sarah gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement, but it did little to ease the tension in Heather's chest. She felt like a woman standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step forward or back away entirely. As the first-class passengers began to disembark, Kevin Lynn lingered, his phone in hand. He had been refreshing his post throughout the descent, watching as the video gained more traction. Hundreds of comments now poured in, each one a testament to the growing divide the footage had exposed. This is exactly what people are talking about when they say racism isn't always overt. Unbelievable. First class should mean respect for everyone. Period. Here we go. Another viral moment over nothing. Kevin glanced at Eleanor, who sat motionless, her hands folded neatly over her bag. The contrast between her calm dignity and the digital storm unfolding in real time struck him deeply. He had meant to capture a moment of injustice, but now he wondered if he had inadvertently exposed her to something much larger and far more complicated. "Mrs. Grant," he said softly, stepping toward her, I hope you know a lot of people are on your side." Eleanor looked up, her expression unreadable. "On my side," she repeated, her voice carrying a note of quiet irony. "That's kind of you to say, Mr. Lynn, but sides aren't always as simple as they seem." Kevin hesitated, unsure how to respond. Before he could find the words, Eleanor stood, her movements deliberate as she reached for her coat. She gave him a small, polite nod before turning toward the aisle. "Take care, Mr. Lynn." The terminal was bustling with the usual chaos of arrivals, families reuniting, business travelers rushing to their next destination, announcements echoing overhead. Eleanor stepped into the crowd with the same poise she had maintained throughout the flight. But inside, she was exhausted. The weight of the day pressed against her chest, a heaviness that felt both familiar and overwhelming. Ahead of her, Heather emerged from the jet bridge, her face pale and drawn. She spotted Eleanor and hesitated, caught in an internal battle. Apologizing once had been difficult enough. But this felt different. It felt personal now, as though her own humanity was on trial. Taking a deep breath, Heather quickened her step and fell in beside Eleanor. "Mrs. Grant," she began, her voice unsteady. Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face her. Heather swallowed hard. "I know I've already said I'm sorry. But I wanted to say it again. I wasn't fair to you. And I see that now." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, her expression calm but penetrating. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, Ms. Davis," she said finally. "But apologies are just the beginning. The question is, what will you do differently next time?" Heather opened her mouth, then closed it again. She hadn't expected Eleanor to hand the responsibility back to her so directly. She stammered, then nodded. "I'll figure it out." Eleanor gave her a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good, because people are always watching, Ms. Davis, and what they see can change more than you realize." With that, Eleanor turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Heather stood rooted to the spot, the noise of the terminal fading into the background as Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. Meanwhile, in a sleek corporate office miles away, Charles Harrington sat at his desk, scrolling through the now viral video. His lips curved into a small, calculating smile as he read the flood of comments. For Harrington, this was more than just a moment of public outrage, it was an opportunity. He had spent years positioning himself as the quiet rival to Victor Grant, subtly undermining the airline's founding principles of fairness and equity. This incident was the perfect chance to strike. He picked up his phone and dialed his assistant. "I want a full report on the incident," he said smoothly. "Focus on the optics and potential liability. And reach out to the media, let's make sure this stays in the headlines." Harrington leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he gazed out the window. The narrative he would craft was already forming in his mind. A story not about Eleanor's dignity or the airline's values, but about inefficiency, distraction, and misplaced priorities. He didn't care about justice or fairness. For him, this was about power. By the time Eleanor reached the curb, her driver was waiting. She slipped into the backseat of the sleek black car and exhaled deeply, finally allowing herself a moment of stillness. Her phone buzzed in her bag, but she ignored it. She knew what awaited her there: messages from friends and colleagues who had seen the video, requests for interviews, a wave of attention she hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. As the car pulled away from the terminal, Eleanor stared out the window, her reflection faint against the city lights. She thought of the man on the plane, of Heather, of Kevin Lynn and his phone. She thought of Charles Harrington, though she didn't yet know his name. And she thought of Victor, waiting for her at home, his steady presence the one constant in an ever-shifting world. She closed her eyes, the hum of the car soothing but unable to quiet the storm inside her. The fight was far from over. But Eleanor Grant had never been one to back down from a fight. The black sedan pulled up to Eleanor Grant's brownstone as the city's lights shimmered against the evening sky. Eleanor stepped out, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. Inside the house, the warmth of home awaited a place where she could exhale, if only for a moment. But as she crossed the threshold, her phone vibrated insistently in her bag. The digital storm she had avoided all day refused to quiet. Victor was waiting in the living room, a tumbler of scotch in hand and his face etched with concern. His broad shoulders, once symbols of youthful ambition, now bore the weight of years spent navigating the fine line between success and survival. When Eleanor entered, he set the glass down and rose to meet her. "You've been on my mind since you called," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've seen the video." Eleanor dropped her bag onto the sofa, her movements deliberate but heavy. "Then you know," she replied. "It's out there now." Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yes, and it's already started to snowball. The media has picked it up. Harrington is making noise." At the mention of Charles Harrington's name, Eleanor felt a familiar fire ignite within her. "Of course, he is," she said, sinking into a chair. "He's been waiting for something like this, an excuse to twist the narrative." Victor leaned against the edge of the fireplace, his fingers brushing the rim of his glass. "What's our next move?" Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes unyielding. "We don't run from this, Victor. We use it. Let Harrington play his games. The truth will outlast whatever story he tries to spin." Miles away, Harrington sat in a high-rise office, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he sought to conquer. His public relations team had just briefed him on their progress. The video was circulating widely, and his carefully curated commentary was beginning to shape the conversation. "This isn't about race," Harrington said smoothly to his team, gesturing toward the screen where the video played on a loop. "This is about professionalism, about ensuring that every passenger, regardless of who they are, receives equal treatment. That's the story we're telling." One of his advisors, a younger man with sharp features and an eager demeanor, hesitated. "Sir, some of the backlash is focusing on systemic issues. They're saying this isn't an isolated incident." Harrington's smile didn't falter, but his tone sharpened. "Then we make it clear that this airline, my airline, is committed to addressing any concerns. But we do it on my terms. Control the narrative, and you control the perception." Back at the brownstone, Eleanor sat with Victor in the dimly lit living room. The noise of the day seemed to settle into the corners of the room, leaving behind an uneasy quiet. "You should know," Victor began, his voice careful. "Some of the comments, they've turned ugly." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but Victor knew her well enough to see the tension in her shoulders. "They always do," she said simply. "People will say anything when they don't have to look you in the eye." Victor hesitated, then reached for her hand. "It's different now, Eleanor. This isn't just whispers in a room. This is the world watching." Eleanor turned to him, her gaze steady. "Then let them watch." The next morning, the story had grown into something neither Eleanor nor Victor could have anticipated. News outlets dissected the incident with the same precision they reserved for political scandals. Panelists debated whether Eleanor's treatment was symptomatic of a larger issue or an isolated event blown out of proportion. Social media swirled with hashtags. #respect for Eleanor. #flying while black. #do better airlines. Amid the support, there was vitriol comments that revealed the deep undercurrents of resentment and bias lurking just beneath the surface of polite society. At the same time, employees within the airline were grappling with their own reckonings. In a cramped break room, Sarah Lopez sat with a group of colleagues, their voices hushed but urgent. "It's not just about Eleanor," Sarah said, her tone firm. "This happens all the time. To passengers and to us. It's just that no one ever sees it." One of the other attendants, a middle-aged man with graying hair, sighed. "And what are we supposed to do? Sarah? Speak up and risk losing our jobs?" Sarah's jaw tightened. "We can't keep quiet anymore. If we do, nothing changes." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy blanket. One by one, the attendants exchanged glances, their shared frustration bubbling to the surface. Quietly, almost reluctantly, they nodded. Eleanor spent the day fielding calls from reporters, friends, and colleagues, all of them offering advice or asking for statements. But what stuck with her most was a call from a young black woman who worked in customer service for the airline. Her voice trembled as she spoke, recounting how she had been passed over for promotions, how she had been told to smile more when she voiced concerns. "You don't know me," the woman said, her voice cracking, "but what you're doing, it matters. It makes me feel like I'm not crazy for noticing these things." When the call ended, Eleanor sat in silence, her phone still in her hand. For every woman like her who had endured and survived, there were others just beginning their journeys, others who needed to see that dignity and resistance could coexist. By the time the evening rolled around, the storm had grown louder. Harrington was now openly criticizing Victor's leadership, using the incident to argue that the airline had lost its focus. The media latched onto the controversy, framing it as a battle for the soul of the company. But Eleanor wasn't rattled. She had faced storms before, and she knew how to weather them. Sitting at her desk, she drafted a statement, not one of apology or defense, but of intention. It was short, pointed, and powerful. "The events of this week are not just about me. They are about a deeper truth that so many of us live with every day. This is not a time for silence. It is a time for action, for honesty, and for change. I stand by the belief that dignity is not a privilege, but a right, and I will not rest until that belief is reflected in every corner of this company and beyond." She hit send, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe. The fight was far from over, but Eleanor Grant was ready. The morning sun crept through the edges of the curtains in Eleanor Grant's study, bathing the room in a soft, golden light, yet the warmth of the day did little to ease the chill that had settled over her. She sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen as the world outside seemed to rage with voices both for and against her. Eleanor had become more than a passenger on a flight, she was now a symbol. Willingly or not, for something much larger. Victor appeared in the doorway, a cup of coffee in hand. "It started," he said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of what they both knew was coming. Eleanor nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of the statement she had written the night before. It had taken on a life of its own, circulating on social media and being quoted in articles and opinion pieces. But with that attention came resistance, some subtle, some outright vicious. The comments she had ignored the day before now seemed to echo louder. Even in the quiet of her home, at the airline's headquarters, a meeting was underway. The boardroom was tense, filled with executives who had once been allies but now seemed unsure. Victor sat at the head of the table, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. At the far end of the table was Charles Harrington, leaning back in his chair with a smirk that suggested he knew exactly how to manipulate the moment. "This isn't sustainable, Victor," Harrington said smoothly, his voice laced with feigned concern. "The longer this drags on, the worse it's going to be for the company. We need to make a public statement that distances the airline from certain controversies." Victor's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "By certain controversies, you mean my wife standing up for herself after being mistreated on one of our flights?" Harrington's smirk faltered for a moment, but he recovered quickly. "I'm talking about optics. We can't afford to alienate our core customer base." "Optics?" Victor repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What about values, Charles? What about integrity? Or have those become inconvenient for you?" The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Harrington leaned forward, his smirk replaced by a hard edge. "This isn't about values, Victor. It's about business. And right now, your wife's crusade is bad for business." Victor's fist tightened on the table. But before he could respond, another voice broke the silence. "I disagree." All heads turned to the doorway, where Sarah Lopez stood, her expression resolute. She had been invited to speak to the board at Victor's request, though she had almost backed out at the last minute. But now, standing in the doorway, she felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. "I've worked for this airline for 5 years," Sarah began, stepping into the room, "and I've seen firsthand how much we need this change. What happened to Mrs. Grant wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a culture that we've all ignored for too long." Harrington's eyes narrowed. "And you think dragging this company through the mud is the way to fix it?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I think ignoring it is worse. If we don't address this now, openly and honestly, it's going to happen again. And next time, it won't just be a video on social media. It'll be a lawsuit, or a boycott, or worse." The room buzzed with murmurs. But Sarah pressed on. "People aren't asking for perfection. They're asking for accountability. And if we can't give them that, we don't deserve their trust." Outside the boardroom, Heather Davis sat in the break room, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea. She had avoided the meeting, unsure of where she fit into the conversation. But the weight of her actions on that flight still hung over her like a shadow. One of her colleagues entered the room and hesitated when she saw Heather. "They're talking about you in there," the woman said, her tone a mixture of curiosity and caution. Heather looked up, her expression weary. "I figured they would." The woman sat across from her, lowering her voice. "What are you going to do?" Heather shook her head. "I don't know. I've already apologized to Mrs. Grant. But it doesn't feel like enough." Her colleague leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Then do more. If you're serious about fixing this, start by fixing yourself." Heather's grip tightened on the mug as the words settled over her. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who treated people fairly. But now she saw how blind she had been to her own biases, to the small, unthinking ways she had contributed to a culture that allowed people like Eleanor to be treated as less than. Meanwhile, Eleanor was preparing for her next step. She had received dozens of interview requests, but there was one she couldn't ignore. A major news network had offered her a primetime slot, and after much deliberation, she had agreed. As the camera lights flickered on that evening, Eleanor sat across from the host, her back straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. The interviewer leaned forward, his tone careful but probing. "Mrs. Grant, your story has sparked a national conversation about race, privilege, and accountability. What do you hope will come of all this?" Eleanor took a deep breath. Her gaze steady. "I hope," she began, her voice clear and deliberate, "that this conversation doesn't end with me. This isn't about one flight, one airline, or even one industry. It's about the daily indignities that so many people face. The subtle and not so subtle ways they're told they don't belong. And it's about whether we, as a society, have the courage to confront those truths and do better." The host nodded, but his next question carried an edge. "Some have criticized you for making this about race. How do you respond to that?" Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line before she answered. "It's not me who made it about race," she said calmly. "It's the systems and attitudes that treated me differently because of it. Ignoring that reality doesn't make it go away. It just ensures that it continues." Back at the brownstone, Victor watched the interview from the living room, his chest swelling with pride. But as the camera cut back to the studio, his phone buzzed with a new notification. Harrington's team had just released a statement, one that painted the controversy as a distraction from the company's goals. Victor read the statement aloud, his voice tight with anger. "This isn't a distraction," he muttered to himself. "It's the point." Eleanor returned home late that night, the exhaustion clear in her face but her resolve unbroken. She sat beside Victor, their hands entwined as they stared out into the quiet city. The fight was escalating, the stakes growing higher with each passing day. But Eleanor knew one thing for certain: she wasn't backing down. The lines had been drawn, and the battle for truth and accountability had only just begun. The day began with a deceptive calm, the kind that masked the turmoil bubbling just beneath the surface. Eleanor Grant sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, the morning light filtering through the lace curtains. Victor stood across from her, his laptop open to the latest headlines. The media storm that had enveloped their lives was no longer just a conversation, it was a full-blown reckoning. "Have you seen this?" Victor asked, tilting the screen toward her. The headline read, "Corporate leadership divided as airline scandal escalates." Below it, a picture of Eleanor was juxtaposed with one of Charles Harrington, his smirk almost daring the world to challenge him. Eleanor didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. "I don't need to see it to know what it says," she replied, her voice steady but weary. "He's framing this as a clash of personalities. But this isn't about me or him. It's about something much larger." Victor closed the laptop with a sigh. "Larger or not, Harrington's making it personal. He's using every trick in the book to discredit you and by extension, me." Eleanor looked up, meeting his gaze, then let him. "We'll meet him with the truth." At the airline headquarters, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Employees whispered in hallways, their conversations punctuated by nervous glances. Sarah Lopez sat in a conference room with a group of flight attendants, her voice clear and resolute. "This isn't just about Mrs. Grant," Sarah said, leaning forward. "It's about all of us. How many times have we seen passengers like her, people of color, older passengers, anyone who doesn't fit the image, treated differently? How many times have we stayed quiet because we were afraid to speak up?" The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Finally, a young attendant spoke up, her voice trembling. "I've seen it too. And I've felt it. I've been passed over for promotions, talked down to by passengers and sometimes by my own colleagues." Another attendant nodded. "We've all felt it. But what do we do about it? How do we fight something so ingrained?" Sarah straightened her shoulders. "We start by telling the truth. And we don't stop until they listen." Meanwhile, in his sleek office, Charles Harrington was playing a different game. He sat at his desk, surrounded by advisors and PR specialists. On his desk were drafts of a press release, each one carefully worded to deflect blame and undermine Eleanor's credibility. "We focus on stability," Harrington said, his tone measured. "The public doesn't want to hear about systemic change. They want to know their flights will be on time, their service will be seamless, and their experience will be predictable." One of his advisors hesitated. "But what if this backfires? What if people see it as dismissive?" Harrington's smirk returned. "Then we spin it. We frame it as prioritizing the customer's needs over internal distractions. Trust me, it'll work." The tension reached a breaking point later that afternoon. Eleanor had been invited to speak at a community forum, An event organized by local activists to address workplace discrimination. The room was packed, the energy palpable as people gathered to hear her story and share their own. As Eleanor stepped onto the stage, the murmurs quieted, replaced by an expectant silence. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning faces filled with hope, anger, and determination. "I never asked to be here," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never wanted to become a symbol or a headline. All I wanted was to sit in the seat I paid for and be treated with the same respect as anyone else." The crowd murmured in agreement, a low hum of solidarity. "But what I've learned," Eleanor continued, "is that my experience is not unique. It's part of a pattern, one that so many of you know all too well. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we going to do about it?" From the back of the room, Sarah stood, her voice clear and unwavering. "We fight," she said. "We fight for policies that protect us, for accountability at every level. And we don't stop until things change." The room erupted in applause, the energy crackling like a live wire. Eleanor smiled, a rare, genuine smile that carried both gratitude and resolve. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for everyone in that room. But the fight was far from over. That evening, Harrington's team released a scathing statement, accusing Eleanor of stoking division and distracting from the company's mission. The media latched onto it, framing the conflict as a war of egos rather than a call for justice. Victor read the statement aloud as Eleanor paced the living room, her steps measured but heavy. "This is exactly what he wants," Victor said, setting the paper down. "He's trying to paint you as the problem." Eleanor stopped pacing and turned to him. "Then we show them who the real problem is. Not with words, but with action." The next day, Eleanor, Sarah, and a coalition of employees held a press conference. They stood side by side, a united front against the forces trying to silence them. Sarah spoke first, recounting her own experiences and calling for systemic change within the airline. Then Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady but fierce. "This isn't about division," she said, her words cutting through the noise. "It's about accountability. It's about whether we're willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about how we treat one another and whether we're brave enough to do better." The press conference was live-streamed, and within hours, it became the most talked about story in the country. Support poured in from unexpected places: celebrities, activists, even rival airlines. But so did the backlash, with Harrington doubling down on his campaign to discredit Eleanor. That evening, Eleanor sat on the porch of her brownstone, the city's hum a distant backdrop. Victor joined her, handing her a cup of tea. "You did good today," he said softly. Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not enough," she said. "Not yet, but it's a start." The fight was far from over, and the challenges ahead loomed large. But as Eleanor sat there, surrounded by the quiet strength of her home, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone in this battle. And together, they were stronger than any storm Harrington or the world could throw at them. The city's rhythm had shifted, as if it too could feel the weight of the battle unfolding in boardrooms, community halls, and living rooms. Eleanor Grant's name was no longer confined to the airline's flight logs or whispered conversations among passengers. It was now spoken in households across the country. For some, she was a hero. For others, she was a provocateur. But for Eleanor herself, she was simply a woman who refused to bow to indignity. At the airline's headquarters, Victor faced the board yet again, the tension thick as the stakes grew higher. Charles Harrington sat at the far end of the long table, a picture of smug confidence. His hands were steepled, his gaze locked on Victor as though daring him to falter. "The numbers don't lie," Harrington began, sliding a folder across the table. "Our stock value has taken a hit since this fiasco began. Public confidence is waning. If we don't take decisive action, we risk long-term damage." Victor picked up the folder, flipping through it without looking up. "And what decisive action do you propose, Charles?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with steel. Harrington leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. "We shift focus. We emphasize the company's commitment to its core values: efficiency, customer satisfaction, and professionalism, and we distance ourselves from divisive figures." The implication hung heavy in the air. Victor closed the folder and set it aside. "So your solution is to sweep this under the rug?" To pretend the problem doesn't exist? Harrington's smirk faltered. The problem, Victor, is that we've allowed one incident to overshadow the bigger picture. We need to move on. Victor's voice rose, breaking the tension like a crack of thunder. We don't move on from systemic issues, Charles. We face them. We fix them. The room fell silent, the weight of Victor's words reverberating through the air. Harrington's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Meanwhile, Eleanor prepared for a meeting of her own. She had been invited to speak at a gathering of community leaders and activists, a coalition that had taken up her cause as a rallying cry. The venue was modest, a local church basement, but the energy inside was electric. As Eleanor stepped to the front of the room, she felt the eyes of the crowd on her, their anticipation palpable. These weren't strangers, they were people who understood, intimately, the injustices she had endured. They had lived them too. I'm not here to tell you what you already know, Eleanor began, her voice calm but resonant. We all know what it feels like to be told, in ways big and small, that we don't belong, that we're too much or not enough. The room nodded in silent agreement, the air thick with unspoken stories. But this moment, Eleanor continued, isn't just about what we've been through. It's about what we're going to do. It's about showing them that our dignity isn't up for debate, that our place in this world isn't theirs to decide. Applause broke out, sharp and affirming, but Eleanor held up a hand. This fight won't be easy. They'll try to wear us down, to make us doubt ourselves, to make us believe that change isn't worth the cost. But I promise you it is. As Eleanor rallied her supporters, Harrington was busy orchestrating his next move. He had arranged for a series of interviews with sympathetic media outlets, his talking points polished to a gleam. This isn't about race, Harrington said smoothly during a live broadcast. It's about professionalism. It's about ensuring that every passenger receives the same level of respect and service. The interviewer leaned forward. But don't you think the incident involving Mrs. Grant highlights deeper issues within the company? Harrington's smile tightened, but his tone remained measured. Mrs. Grant's experience is unfortunate, but it's not indicative of a systemic problem. We're committed to fairness and equality, and we'll continue to uphold those values. The public wasn't convinced. Online, the backlash against Harrington's statements was swift and unforgiving. Social media flooded with personal stories from employees and passengers alike, their accounts painting a damning picture of the airline's culture. Sarah Lopez watched the storm unfold from her apartment, her laptop glowing in the dim light. She had started compiling testimonies from colleagues anonymized for their protection and sharing them with journalists who were beginning to dig deeper. One message caught her attention, a young attendant's account of being reprimanded for overstepping when she defended a passenger of color. Sarah's chest tightened as she read the words, the story hitting too close to home. She closed her laptop and picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over Eleanor's number. After a moment's hesitation, she dialed. Eleanor answered on the second ring. Sarah, she said, her tone warm despite the hour. What's on your mind? Sarah hesitated, the words tangled in her throat. I've been gathering stories, she said finally, from other employees, about what's really been happening in the company. Eleanor's voice softened. That's brave, Sarah, and necessary. But it's not enough, Sarah said, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Harrington's spinning this so fast, and I feel like we're falling behind. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Change doesn't happen in a straight line, Sarah. It's messy, and slow, and hard, but every step matters. What you're doing matters. The next morning, Eleanor, Sarah, and Victor convened in the Brownstones' living room. They were joined by a small group of Allies employees, activists, and even a few shareholders who had grown disillusioned with Harrington's tactics. We need to take this to the board, Victor said, his voice firm. Harrington's trying to force a vote to strip us of our influence. If we don't act now, he'll succeed. And then what? Sarah asked. Even if we stop him, the culture doesn't change overnight. Eleanor's gaze was steady. It doesn't. But this fight isn't just about today. It's about tomorrow. And the day after that. It's about making sure that the next Eleanor Grant doesn't have to fight this hard to be treated with dignity. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, one by one, they nodded. The storm was still raging, but Eleanor and her allies were ready to face it head on. This wasn't just a battle for an airline. It was a battle for the soul of a system, and they wouldn't back down. The boardroom had never felt so small. The usual hum of polite conversation was replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint rustle of papers and the quiet tapping of Charles Harrington's pen against the polished mahogany table. Eleanor Grant sat at one end of the room, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her, Victor exuded a quiet intensity, his presence a steadying force in the midst of the storm. At the opposite end of the table, Harrington leaned back in his chair, the picture of confidence. His smirk lingered like a dare, his fingers steepled as though he were already counting his victory. Around the table, the board members shifted uneasily, their gazes flicking between Eleanor and Harrington. They were here to vote not just on the fate of Eleanor and Victor's leadership, but on the soul of the company itself. The tension had been building for weeks. Harrington's smear campaign had gained traction, his narrative spreading through media outlets and investor circles. He had painted Eleanor as a divisive figure, her fight for justice recast as a threat to the airline's stability. The stock had dipped, and Harrington seized on the moment, rallying shareholders to his side with promises of restoring order. But Eleanor and Victor weren't unprepared. They had spent the last few days gathering allies, employees, passengers, and even shareholders who had grown tired of Harrington's manipulative tactics. Sarah Lopez had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, compiling testimonies and data that painted a stark picture of the airline's systemic issues. And now, as the board meeting began, it was time to lay everything on the table. Harrington was the first to speak, his tone polished and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, spreading his hands in a gesture of reasonableness, "we are at a crossroads. The events of the past month have brought unnecessary scrutiny to our company, jeopardizing our reputation and financial stability. We cannot afford to let personal crusades derail us any further." Eleanor didn't flinch, but she felt the sting of his words. He wasn't just attacking her fight for justice, he was attacking her personhood, reducing her to a disruption, a problem to be managed. Harrington continued, his voice rising with false conviction. "It's time for decisive leadership, for a return to the values that built this company. I propose a vote to reallocate executive responsibilities and streamline our operations to focus on what truly matters: profitability and customer satisfaction." The room was silent as Harrington sat down, his smirk widening as though he had already won. Victor stood next, his tone calm but commanding. "What Charles has failed to mention," he began, "is that the scrutiny we're facing isn't unnecessary, it's overdue. The issues that have come to light aren't distractions, they're symptoms of a culture that needs to change." He gestured toward Sarah, who rose and handed out folders to the board members. "Inside, you'll find data and first-hand accounts from employees and passengers." Victor continued, "These aren't isolated incidents, they're part of a pattern that we can't afford to ignore." As the board members flipped through the folders, murmurs rippled through the room. The testimonies were damning, stories of microaggressions, discriminatory practices, and a culture that prioritized appearances over inclusivity. One account, written by a former flight attendant, described how she had been penalized for speaking out against unfair treatment. Another detailed how passengers of color were often given less leeway when dealing with delays or complaints. Eleanor watched the board members' faces shift from skepticism to discomfort. This was the truth they had been avoiding, laid bare in black and white. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she rose slowly, her movements deliberate. The room stilled as she began. "I didn't want to be here," she said, her voice clear but heavy with emotion. "Not because I'm afraid to fight, but because I shouldn't have to. None of us should." She placed her hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "But here I am, and I'm not here because of one flight or one moment. I'm here because this company, this industry, and this society have allowed injustice to persist for too long. And I won't stand by and let it continue." Eleanor's gaze swept the room, her eyes meeting each board member in turn. "This isn't just about me. It's about every employee who's been overlooked, every passenger who's been mistreated, and every person who's been made to feel like they don't belong. We have a choice today, to do what's easy, or to do what's right." The room was silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Harrington didn't wait long to counter. "Eloquent as always, Mrs. Grant," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But rhetoric doesn't pay the bills. What this company needs is action, not sentiment." Eleanor didn't sit down. She met Harrington's gaze with a calm that cut deeper than any rebuttal. Action without integrity is just noise, Mr. Harrington, she said, and noise won't save this company. Only trust will. The vote was called. One by one, the board members cast their ballots, the tension in the room growing with each passing moment. Harrington's confidence began to waver as he noticed the shifting expressions of his colleagues, their discomfort now directed at him. When the final vote was tallied, the result was clear. Eleanor and Victor's leadership was reaffirmed, and Harrington's proposal was rejected. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of barely concealed rage. As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor remained seated, letting the victory settle over her like a heavy but welcome weight. Victor placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and steady. "We did it," he said softly. Eleanor nodded, but her expression remained somber. "This isn't the end," she said. "It's just the beginning." Outside the boardroom, Sarah stood with a group of employees who had gathered to await the outcome. When Eleanor and Victor emerged, the group broke into quiet applause, their faces alight with hope. Eleanor smiled, a rare, genuine smile that carried both relief and determination. She turned to Sarah, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You were right," she said. "This fight isn't just about today. It's about tomorrow and every day after that." The storm hadn't passed, but the tide had turned. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt the possibility of calm on the horizon. The aftermath of the boardroom vote was far from quiet. The next morning, news outlets buzzed with headlines. Social media exploded with commentary. And the airline's employees were abuzz with a sense of cautious hope. Eleanor Grant had won a critical battle. But the war against the deeply ingrained inequities of the system was far from over. Eleanor sat at the breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, the steam curling into the morning air. Across from her, Victor scrolled through his tablet, the tension in his jaw a reminder that peace was fleeting. "They're already coming after us," he said, tilting the screen toward her. A prominent news outlet had published an op-ed titled, "The Cost of Eleanor Grant's Crusade. Is it worth it?" The subtitle read, "As the airline pivots to address internal issues, is its focus on profitability slipping?" Eleanor took a slow sip of her tea, her expression unreadable. "Of course they are," she said finally. "Change is never comfortable, especially for those who profit from the status quo." Victor set the tablet down, his eyes meeting hers. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. But it feels like every step forward comes with twice as much pushback." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady, because the truth unsettles people. "Victor, it forces them to see the cracks in their world. And some would rather look away than fix them." At the airline headquarters, Charles Harrington's fury simmered beneath a carefully controlled exterior. The vote had been a public humiliation, a rare defeat for a man who prided himself on always staying one step ahead. But Harrington wasn't finished. He sat in his office, poring over data and strategizing his next move. "We need to pivot," he told his team during an emergency meeting. "If we can't discredit Eleanor Grant outright, we make her the symbol of chaos. Frame her as a disruptor, someone who puts ideals over practicality. The public will turn on her eventually." One of his advisors hesitated. "But the public seems to support her right now. Every time we push back, it only strengthens her narrative." Harrington's glare was ice cold. "Then we change the narrative. Find weaknesses, exploit them. This isn't over." While Harrington schemed, Eleanor and her allies pushed forward. Sarah Lopez had become an integral part of the movement, her voice amplifying the stories of employees who had long been silenced. Together with Eleanor, she organized a town hall meeting, inviting employees, passengers, and community members to share their experiences and demand change. The event was held in a packed auditorium, the air buzzing with anticipation. Eleanor stood at the podium, her presence commanding but approachable. She began not with a speech, but with a question. "How many of you have ever felt invisible?" she asked, her voice resonant but soft. "How many of you have been made to feel that your worth is tied to someone else's idea of who you should be?" Hands rose across the room, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. The atmosphere shifted, the shared vulnerability knitting the audience together in an unspoken bond. Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "This isn't just about an airline. It's about a system that thrives on keeping people in their place. But we don't have to accept that. Change doesn't come from waiting for permission. It comes from standing together and demanding better. The audience erupted in applause, the sound filling the room with a fierce energy. But as Eleanor stepped back from the podium, her chest tightened. She knew that for every person in that room, there were countless others watching, waiting, and hoping she would fail. The opposition's attacks grew sharper in the days that followed. Harrington's team leaked internal memos suggesting that Eleanor's advocacy was causing disruptions within the company. Anonymous sources claimed that employees were frustrated with the changes, framing her as a divisive figure rather than a unifying force. Eleanor read the headlines with a sinking feeling but refused to show it. "They're scared," she told Sarah during a late-night call. "They wouldn't fight this hard if they didn't feel their power slipping." Sarah's voice was steady but tinged with exhaustion. "It's working, though. Some of the employees are starting to question whether this fight is worth it. They're tired." "Eleanor, so am I," Eleanor admitted, "but we don't get to stop just because it's hard." The tipping point came during a live televised debate between Victor and Harrington. The two men sat across from each other, the studio lights glaring as they exchanged arguments before a national audience. "This isn't about race or justice," Harrington said, his tone measured but pointed. "This is about maintaining stability. Mrs. Grant's efforts, while well-intentioned, have created chaos. The company can't function if every decision is second-guessed, every action scrutinized." Victor leaned forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "What Charles calls chaos, I call accountability. And what he calls stability is just a comfortable way of keeping things the same. We're not here to maintain the status quo. We're here to create a company that truly reflects the values it claims to stand for." The debate raged on, the tension palpable, but Victor's final words cut through the noise like a blade. "Progress isn't comfortable," he said. "It's messy and difficult and sometimes painful. But it's the only way forward. And if we don't have the courage to face it, then we have no business calling ourselves leaders." The debate shifted the tide. Public support for Eleanor and Victor surged, and employees who had been hesitant began to rally behind them. But the victory came with a cost. Eleanor found herself exhausted, the weight of the fight taking a toll on her body and spirit. One evening, as she sat alone in her study, Victor entered quietly and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've done more than enough," he said softly. "You don't have to carry this alone." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and determination. "I know," she said, "but this isn't just about me. It never was. And as long as there's breath in my body, I'll keep fighting." Victor nodded, his own resolve deepening. Together, they would see this through no matter the cost. The auditorium was alive with anticipation, a murmur of voices blending into a steady hum. Rows of seats filled with employees, activists, and members of the press all gathered to witness what had been billed as a turning point for the airline and, perhaps, for something much larger. At the center of it all was Eleanor Grant, seated at a long table beside Victor, Sarah Lopez, and a handful of allies who had risen to prominence during the fight. Eleanor sat with her hands folded, her face composed but her heart racing. Today was the culmination of weeks, months, no, years of resistance, resilience, and resolve. She glanced at Victor, whose steady gaze offered her the reassurance she didn't realize she needed. Behind the podium, the company's interim spokesperson cleared his throat, calling the room to order. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice trembling slightly under the weight of the moment. "Today, we address not just the challenges we've faced, but the opportunities ahead." In the audience, Charles Harrington sat in the shadows, his jaw tight. Though his campaign against Eleanor and Victor had failed, his presence was a reminder that the forces resisting change were far from vanquished. He leaned back in his chair, his expression one of quiet disdain, but his mind was already calculating his next move. As the spokesperson continued with opening remarks, the room's energy shifted. It wasn't until Eleanor stepped to the podium that the hum of voices quieted entirely. She stood tall, her years of experience and conviction evident in every measured step. "I want to begin," she said, her voice steady, "by acknowledging the courage of those who have spoken up, who have risked their own comfort and security to demand something better not just for themselves, but for everyone." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on her. What happened to me on that flight was not unique. It was part of a system, one that too often rewards silence and punishes those who dare to speak out. But silence has never been my way. And it cannot be ours. In the weeks leading up to this moment, the fight had intensified. After Victor's fiery debate with Harrington, employees began organizing in earnest, demanding structural changes to the company's policies. Proposals included mandatory bias training, increased representation in leadership, and protections for employees who reported discrimination. These demands were met with resistance not just from Harrington's faction, but from those who feared what such changes might cost. Meetings grew heated, with shouting matches breaking out between opposing sides. At times, Eleanor wondered if the fractures within the company were too deep to mend. But then, a breakthrough came. A coalition of employees and shareholders banded together to present a unified front, forcing the board to take their proposals seriously. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was enough to get the reforms on the table. Back in the auditorium, Eleanor continued, her words gaining momentum. "Change is never easy," she said, her voice rising. "It challenges us. It makes us uncomfortable. But discomfort is where growth begins. And we cannot grow as a company or as a society if we are unwilling to confront the truths that make us uncomfortable." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "We've heard the arguments against this fight. That it's too disruptive, that it's bad for business, that it asks too much, too soon. But let me ask you this. How much longer should we wait? How much more should we endure before we decide enough is enough?" Applause rippled through the room, starting hesitantly but growing louder with each passing moment. Even those who had remained skeptical found themselves drawn in by Eleanor's quiet power. At the back of the room, Sarah watched with a mixture of awe and pride. She thought of the journey that had brought them here, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, the whispered conversations that had grown into a movement. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that real change was possible. But as she scanned the room, her gaze landed on Harrington. He was leaning forward slightly now, his expression unreadable but his presence undeniable. Sarah's stomach tightened. He wasn't finished. Not yet. Eleanor concluded her speech with a call to action, her voice unwavering. "This is not the end of the fight," she said. "It is the beginning. What we've accomplished so far is not enough, not until everyone who walks through our doors, boards our planes, or wears our uniform knows they are valued and respected. This is the standard we must hold ourselves to. And I will not rest until it is met." The applause was deafening, a wave of sound that filled the auditorium and spilled into the hallways beyond. Eleanor stepped back from the podium, her chest rising and falling with the effort of holding back tears. She wasn't someone who cried easily, but the enormity of the moment threatened to overwhelm her. Victor reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You did it," he whispered. Eleanor shook her head slightly. "We did it." In the days that followed, the airline announced a series of sweeping reforms. New policies were implemented, employees were given platforms to share their experiences, and leadership underwent significant restructuring. Harrington, though still a presence, found his influence waning as public and internal pressure mounted. But the fight was far from over. Eleanor knew that change didn't come with a single vote or a well-crafted policy. It was a continuous effort, one that required vigilance and persistence. Still, for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel fully before: hope. Late one evening, Eleanor sat on the porch of her brownstone, the city's hum a distant backdrop. Sarah joined her, a cup of tea in her hands. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind that only comes after shared struggle. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Do you think it'll last? The change?" Eleanor took a long sip of her tea before answering. "I think it'll last as long as we're willing to fight for it. And I don't plan on stopping anytime soon." Sarah smiled, her admiration for Eleanor evident in her eyes. "Neither do I." As the stars appeared one by one in the night sky, Eleanor allowed herself a rare moment of peace. The storm wasn't over, but the light was breaking through. And that, she thought, was enough to keep going. For now, for tomorrow, for every battle yet to come.